Around 50% of Germans live in rented accommodations, and around 60 of rented flats in Germany are owned by private individuals, and you can find out why both are a good option in this video.
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
We've looked at how to buy property in Germany and what you need to consider if you want to build. Today we take a look at what it's like to rent. Rented accommodation has been around since ancient times and is not a modern invention. During the period of industrialization, the housing shortage in large cities was so great that around 1875, more than 1 in 5 flats in Berlin were occupied by sleepers, Schlafgänger. These were poor laborers who rented a bed in a flat for a few pennies. Even though the housing market in Berlin is still tight, I'm not aware that there would still be sleepers. In fact, the number of private landlords in Germany has been on the rise in recent years. There are various reasons for this. On the one hand, people who can afford it like to invest money, also to save on taxes, and property is not called Betongold, concrete gold, for nothing, as it will generate income in the future. Some people simply build their own home a little bigger. They may have an additional small flat that they currently rent out while they live in the main part with their family and then move out of the large part into the small flat when they are alone as a couple and rent out the other part. It is therefore not unusual for the landlord to live in the same house. The laws in Germany are such that there are clear rules for both sides. If you read an advert in Germany, it talks about rooms, Zimmer, and square meters. Here I have discussed some adverts in detail. The kitchen, bathroom, and balcony are not separated rooms and, like a possible hallway, do not count as rooms. A cellar or storage room does not count as a room either. Rooms, Zimmer, must have at least one window and a door. The basic rent, Kaltmiete, is then calculated on the basis of the number of square meters. Whether a winter garden or a pitched roof can be included in the area is specified. This information can also be found in the Mietvertrag, tenancy agreement. Theoretically, this can also be concluded verbally, but is usually always in writing. In a tenancy agreement, it is very important whether it is concluded for a fixed term, for example, with a defined end date, or without a fixed term. With a fixed term, the tenancy agreement ends on the date without a notice. Conversely, this contract can often not be cancelled beforehand unless there is an exceptional reason. An open-ended contract does not actually end at all, and it can only be terminated by the landlord for a valid reason, for example, personal use. In our example, if the family now wants to have an au pair in the larger part and needs the living space in the small flat for the au pair, you could terminate the contract for personal use. However, the tenant can also object to the cancellation. Otherwise, the tenants have a good chance of living there until they no longer want to. The notice period for the landlord also increases from 3 months to 6 months or more if the tenancy has been in place for a long time. Tenants, on the other hand, can terminate an open-ended contract with 3 months' notice. There are, of course, also reasons for extraordinary termination. If the tenant does not pay the rent on time, or if the landlord increases the rent, the other party may have an extraordinary right of termination. As with an employment contract, the termination must be in writing. This means that the tenant has an advantage when it comes to cancelling a rental agreement. The amount of rent is also regulated. In old cities with a population over 50,000 and often below, there are local comparative rents. The rent may not be more than 20% higher, otherwise the rent may be too high in accordance with paragraph 5 of the German Commercial Penal Code. If the rent is 50% too high, this constitutes usurious rent. Depending on the furnishings and conditions, the comparative rent may vary upwards or downwards. The rent can also be agreed as a graduated rent, which then increases in future according to certain factors. The basic rent can also be the basis for a possible rental deposit, caution. This may not exceed 3 months' rent. This deposit must be paid into an interest-bearing account by the landlord and is then more on repayment. The repayment must be made 3 to 6 months after the flat has been returned. It is used to compensate for damage for the rental property. If an estate agent has been used to rent or let the flat, the person who commissions the estate agent must pay them. In this case, the estate agent's fee is not shared as is possibly when buying a property, for example. The landlord may inquire about the financial situation or how many people are to live in the flat. Sometimes self-disclosures or the last 3 salary statements are also requested. The questions must be related to the flat and the rental agreement. In addition to the basic rent, there are additional costs that are agreed in the contract, such as heating, overhead, such as insurance, perhaps caretaker or electricity in the communal hallway, and even a share of the property tax. A monthly flat rate is often agreed here, which is calculated in detail at the end of the year, so that there may be a repayment or additional payment. The final invoice must be sent to the tenant in detail. The tenant then also has a right to inspect the receipts in order to check the calculation. Other things can also be agreed in tenancy agreement. Subletting can be linked to certain conditions. The cleaning of communal areas can be agreed, the typical sweeping week, Kehrwoche, where you have to mop the stairwell. An attachment set of house rules is often also part of the tenancy agreement. Cosmetic repairs, such as paintings, can be made the tenant's responsibility in the tenant's agreement. Of course, only to the extent that the tenant is responsible for them. During the tenancy, the tenant must report defects to the landlord and the landlord must rectify the defects. Structural alterations are only permitted with the landlord's consent. And yes, it's true that in many rented flats there are no kitchen units because people usually take the old kitchen with them. But more and more flats have fitted kitchens. In Berlin, there must be a sink and cooking facility, but this can be a simple hob. The background to this arises from the tenancy law. What is in the flat when it's rented out is also rented out and must therefore be maintained by the landlord. Some landlords are afraid that the dishwasher in the kitchen might get blocked or that the hob might stop working. On the other hand, you can often buy the kitchen from the previous tenant if they don't want to take them with them. The landlord does not have a general right to enter the flat. He may have a legitimate interest in individual cases, for example, if a defect needs to be inspected or if he needs to check the cosmetic repairs. Even if this legitimate interest exists, the landlord must agree with the tenant when it's convenient for the tenant. However, the tenant must also make appointments within a reasonable period of time. Should the landlord wish to sell the flat or house, the tenant has a right of first refusal unless the property is to be sold to a relative. Even if the property is sold, the tenancy agreement remains in place and on the same terms. And after purchasing a condominium, the buyer is generally not allowed to terminate the lease for the personal use for the next 3 years. So there are good reasons to rent or let a flat. The German Tenants Association, Deutscher Mieterbund, supports tenants in protecting their rights. Slum flats are also tied to work. In the hotel industry, there are often rooms for employees, or in schools, there are often flats for caretakers, janitors. Employers can often also help to find a flat. It may be advantageous to first find an employer from abroad and then find a flat with their support. Finally, a few warnings. Sometimes there are adverts for particularly cheap flats where the landlord is supposedly based abroad and you have to pay a deposit first. There is no such thing. The rent and the deposit are due at the earliest when a tenancy agreement is signed. Both the tenant and the landlord may present their passport or identity card to each other when signing the contract. Especially with private landlords, the personal impression is very important. This can make it difficult to rent a flat from abroad. In areas where the housing market is tight and there are many applicants for a flat, it can make sense to submit a kind of application in which you advertise yourself as a tenant. Just a two-liner, "I'm interested in the flat, when can I view it?" is not necessarily enough. If you're looking for a flat from abroad, you may have more success with an estate agent. This is a little more expensive, but means less stress and higher probability of success. Good luck with your search for a flat or house. Remarks, addition, and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.